I, J. Robert Doty, coroner of said county on the 17th day of March, 1949, in Gary, county of Lake, state of Indiana, held an inquest.
You are listening to the report of an inquest held by the coroner of Gary, Indiana, where the people act.
The People Act. These are true stories, tape recorded in communities across the nation, where people are working together to build a better future. The People Act is presented by the Television Radio Workshop and produced by the CBS Radio Network. Every voice and sound is real. No actors are used. Now here is your narrator, the noted reporter, Robert Trout.
Some people say the citizens of a democracy cannot act in their own behalf, that today's world is too involved for the voice of the average man to be heard. Well, see if you agree after you hear this story of power and crime. Crime that infests a community and the power of ordinary citizens. It's a story we recorded in the steel town of Gary, Indiana. We took our tape recorders inside one of the giant steel mills that dominate Gary, Indiana. You can hear the sounds. Gary, population 132,000, hard on the shore of Lake Michigan, 31 miles from Chicago. We stopped one man and asked him about his town. This is what he said.
Gary is just a rough and tumble steel town.
We asked another the same question.
Gary is the melting pot of the world.
But outside the mill, we asked Mrs. Florence Grieve to tell us what she and other women of Gary were saying only 4 years ago. She told us.
Gary statistics is the second crime, so is one of the top 3 in vice, and has the worst traffic record in the country.
In 1947, the second highest incidence of crime in the country for cities of its size. Gary was a wide-open town. Gambling flourished. Criminal syndicates operated in defiance of the law. Down at City Hall, we asked Prosecutor David Stanton about the syndicates.
2 major crime syndicates operated in this county. One was the Sonny Sheets, Peck Gardner, Harry Himes, Big House Combine. The other was the syndicate headed by Jack Doyle. The Big House Syndicate employed daily more than 100 men, many of whom were goons, hoodlums, and racketeers out of Chicago.
What about the law enforcement officials, the city officers, the police? Couldn't they do anything about the syndicates? Paul Sear, former candidate for Congress from Gary, told us why they could not.
It was almost an impossible thing politically to drive them out of power because of the money involved. They could buy the elections. They had become the super government behind the scenes. They would put out the dough, elect their officials, and as a result, they would get the protection necessary to let them operate.
Well, how did the people of Gary feel about all this? Weren't they disturbed? This is what one steel mill worker said.
The very complacency of the citizens, I believe, is what allows crime and so forth to flourish, because you can talk to people who are supposedly solid citizens of the community, and they say, well, Gary is just that kind of a town, but none of them offer any reasons as to why it should be so. And as far as that's concerned, they don't seem to do anything about it.
Complacency in the face of crime. That was the picture for a score of years up to 1949. But on March the 3rd of that year, something happened to schoolteacher Mary Cheever that touched off an explosion in Gary. Mary Cheever was showing pictures she'd taken in South America to a parent-teachers meeting. Here's Miss Viola Briley, a member of the group, to tell you what happened.
The meeting had lasted a long time, and it was quite late, and several people urged Mary Cheever not to come home, to stay out in Glen Park, but she said she had several other teachers with her, and that she felt that she should bring them home. She was just coming up the alley, had just gotten to the sidewalk within a few feet of the front door of the apartment, when this fellow grabbed her, and she struggled, and a lady in the apartment across the alley heard her scream and went to the window, and before she could call the police, Mary was killed.
Just another Gary murder, the 8th that year. Nothing to get excited about. But this murder was different. It started something. Oh, it didn't seem like much at the time, just a lot of women making telephone calls.
Mrs. Robinson, I want to ask you to come to a meeting this afternoon. We're all kind of stirred up.
Hello, Mrs. Sachs. Say, Mary Cheever was murdered last night. Could you come to a meeting Sunday? Hello, Mrs. Bachmeyer. You've heard about Mary being murdered. What are we going to do about it? Well, I believe the women of Gary could do something about it. Couldn't we all get together, say, Sunday afternoon? Yes, this Sunday, the 6th, 2 p.m., yeah, in the Y.
A meeting of women called for Sunday at 2 p.m. in the YMCA. There was another kind of meeting on Sunday at 10 a.m. The funeral service for Mary Cheever, held at the First Presbyterian Church. The Reverend F.W. Backemeyer officiated. He spoke of Mary Cheever and of other matters, too.
We come today with sorrowing hearts, yea, with one heart that beats out its grief, along with the loved ones of Mary Cheever. Mary Cheever has paid with her life a debt which our city can never repay. It is a matter of common knowledge that vice and crime go altogether unchallenged. In fact, vice and crime are definitely encouraged in our city. So long as that condition remains, there is just one thing in order: some first-class immediate resignations in our city hall and in our police department. If they cannot enforce the law, they ought to step down. If they don't want to enforce the law, then they should be told to step down.
At 2 o'clock that afternoon, 40 angry women met at the YMCA. They represented every corner of Gary. Listen in on their meeting.
Ladies, I know we're strangers, many of us, to each other, but we won't be for long because I feel this is going to be a long process to get good government. So I'd like for you all to know each other. Would you mind introducing yourselves?
I'm Viola Briley, and I'm representing College Club.
I'm Mrs. Howard Carlson. I'm a member of the National Council of Catholic Women. I'm Mrs. William P. Swan. I'm representing the Central District.
I'm Mrs. F.W. Backemeyer. Mary Cheever was a member of my Sunday school class for 20 years.
Ida K. Sachs from Hadassah.
I'm Catherine Johns, and I don't represent any organization that's very important. I just represent all the women of Gary that are anxious to do something about this, to do away with this terrible situation.
They talked about Mary Cheever, then went on to crime in Gary, and then went on to decide what to do about it.
We've got to do something and do it quick, and this is the time to strike, if you ask me. Well, what do we do? Now, where do we go from here?
Doesn't the city council meet Monday night?
Say, that's right, it does. Yes, sir. Monday night.
And that's just the thing. I think it's just about time we go and present our case to them.
Well, we've got to have numbers. That's the thing. We've got to have numbers. Can we get a mob out? Can we have a mass meeting, do you suppose?
Let's call for all the people in Gary, all the women.
I'll call everybody. I'll get our whole church going.
Well, every paper about it, can't we? Can't we put it on the front page of the Post-Tribune?
Sure, they'll cooperate. They're always for good government. We can get them to... I know they'll help.
We've got to phone.
Everybody call everybody they know and tell them to call everybody they know. Remember, it's got to reach everybody in town, all districts, because none of them are safe.
The women took to the telephones. A meeting of all the women of Gary called for the next day at Siemens Hall, 575 Washington Street. Over 2,000 angry women of Gary turned out for the meeting. Mrs. Russell Griffith addressed them.
In a free, democratic, representative America, where the individual is supposed to be supreme, we have shamefully allowed ourselves to become one of the nation's most despicable examples of no law enforcement. The cries from all over town are, why doesn't somebody do something? We must make this town a safe community in which to live. Together and with God's help, we shall do this. We shall leave from here. We shall march together to the City Hall, to the council chambers, and present this resolution in a body to the mayor and the city council. Let's go.
they went. A march on City Hall, more than 2,000 of them. Robert Moore, a lawyer, saw them go by.
I stood here in my window and looked down at the street and saw what some estimated as 5,000 women marching down to the City Hall. And naturally, you wonder what would be the effect of such a demonstration.
Mr. Moore didn't have to wonder very long. At City Hall, Mrs. Griffith spoke for the group. They demanded concrete action.
The moral laws of mankind. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not kill, are still deeper in the hearts of the Gary people than the terrorizing power of a syndicate or a couple of gangs who seem to know no laws, in some instances protected by our double-duty vice squad and the chief of police.
And Mrs. Florence Grieve read a resolution drawn up by the women of Gary.
Whereas there have been 8 murders in the city since January 1st, 1949, and whereas gambling appears to be one of the main industries in the town, and whereas the law enforcement authorities either cannot or will not adequately protect the citizens, now therefore be it resolved that if the city government does not clean up the city, give it protection, and make it safe for the citizens and their families, the women can and will, with God's help.
The women were promised law enforcement. They went back to their homes, but they didn't disband. They formed a new organization, the Women's Citizens Committee. Prosecutor David Stanton told us what happened next.
Immediately following that group, that march on the City Hall as a nucleus, practically every religious, every fraternal, every patriotic, every social, every civic organization in the city of Gary passed resolutions. Every civic club, every noonday luncheon outfit passed resolutions affiliating themselves with the Women's Citizens Committee, sending representatives to it. Every sorority has joined it. In addition to that, memberships were sold, as you'd say, that is, dues-paying memberships. Within 60 days after their organization, they had a paid membership of some 18,000 people.
The new organization, the WCC, the Women's Citizens Committee, visited the courts, visited police headquarters, gathering information on law enforcement, and then they ran into trouble. Some people didn't want the women of Gary to look too closely at the way their government was being run. The women began to get telephone threats. Mrs. Griffith, as chairlady of the WCC, received her share.
And that one day alone, I had 3 threats. These threats, 2 of them were people that were obviously trying to disguise their voice. One man said, "See here, girlie, got to stop if you want to live." That sort of thing.
Mrs. Hilda Burton was threatened, too. Her husband received the telephone call. He reacted in a surprising way. Mrs. Burton.
My husband had a phone call one day at the office, and it was a member of the city council. And he asked Ed if that happened to be his wife that taught Sunday school at the 43rd Avenue Church, and Ed said yes. And is it your wife that teaches at Lew Wallace School? And he said yes. And he said, well, you've only just opened up in business here in Glen Park. If you're smart, you'll shut her up because you're liable to be closing up your business. And Ed answered him, I thought, rather in a quaint way, in which he said, well, I've been trying to shut her up now for the last 11 years and haven't been too successful, so supposing you try it.
The women tried to joke about the threats. Actually, they were pretty frightened, but they went on. 4.5 months after the march on City Hall, the women met to add up what had been done about crime in Gary. Despite promises, they found that practically nothing had been done. The gambling dens were running wide open as usual. They decided on another kind of action, as citizens to observe and report open violation of the law themselves.
May I call a meeting to order, please? Ladies, 4.5 months ago, we asked for law enforcement. We were promised law enforcement, and we don't have it tonight. This town is wide open.
What can we do about it?
We can go observe.
How do we know where to go?
I've got a list right here, 17 addresses.
Well, and in other words, you're expecting us to go and stand all day long in this temperature?
No,
How
no,
does the
you're
summer-
just one person. It'll take a shift of from 4 to 20 at each address. We'll take 2-hour shifts if you girls want to do it.
Are we going to write names? What are we going to do?
You're going to write everything you see, the number of people that go in the place. If you see any betting going on, you can...
You don't want to say anything to anybody, do you?
I don't want you... Yeah, well, somebody bring a drink of water. I don't want you women... excuse me, to say anything to anybody. You are observing the breakdown of law enforcement in Gary.
But they did something more. They formed the Gary Crime Commission. They hired an outside investigator, John G. Brody, to come into Gary and see if there was any evidence to show why the prosecutor's office was so reluctant to enforce the law. Mr. Brody worked as a janitor and found out.
We waited until there was an opening for a janitorship in the building, and then I worked as a janitor for 3 weeks. The last night I worked there as janitor, I laid a carbon mic right by the light outlet in the ceiling and trained 8 women to operate the recording equipment, which was connected by a wire we strung to a building 300 yards away. These women faithfully recorded for the next 4.5 months. They recorded bribery and corruption in the district attorney's office, the taking of graft, and the extortion of money from poor, unfortunate defendants.
Those secret recordings were the women's secret weapon. They held them until just before the 1950 elections, then let go with both barrels, their aim to get a new public prosecutor. Listen to one of the recordings the women made. The prosecutor's office called syndicate head Jack Doyle to try to get money to swing election precincts their way.
The best guy to see is Jack. Jack Doyle? He'll give it a play. Hello there, Doyle. Doyle there. Hello, Jack. Say, Eli coming out here to talk to you. Will you be there? Right away. Okay.
Those recordings became the key election issue. Election time. The sound trucks blared. The candidates for office were presented to the voters.
The best bunch of candidates ever presented to the voters of the city of Gary. First, Councilman...
The women attended the rallies and presented a questionnaire to the candidates.
First, will you see that places of vice and gambling are closed and kept closed? Will you dismiss any of your appointees?
But the women did more. They organized as poll watchers.
These instructions are for the inside poll watchers. You are not a political party watcher. You are watching in the interests of good government.
And the WCC asked every voter to go to the polls.
We ask you, the voters, to remember that this is your city and that the people who will be elected today will be your city officials. Please consider well, then go to the polls and vote according to your conscience.
The election returns started coming in.
Oh, is that a honey? 77. Oh, let's go. 348. 182.
Before the day was over, it was clear the voters of Gary had elected a new public prosecutor, David Stanton. Stanton took office, called up a grand jury, and in 6 months had delivered to him a stinging report on the tie-up between crime and politics in Gary. Prosecutor Stanton reads the grand jury's conclusion.
An objective view of this picture of wide-open, organized, syndicated vice and crime flourishing in this county for years, without other than token interference and molestation, forces the inescapable conclusion that none of these things could be accomplished without the consent, collusion, connivance, and participation in the profits by prosecuting attorneys, sheriffs, mayors, chiefs of police, and others charged with enforcing the law. These things could not be without widespread bribery, graft, and corruption.
The law began to be enforced to the hilt. Newly elected City Judge Gilbert Grunberg saw the effect of Prosecutor Stanton's Get Tough policy.
Organized gambling and syndicated vice went undercover, and they haven't operated openly since then. And in fact, the big crime syndicate is pretty well cleaned out of Lake County since the first of the year when Stanton took office.
There were other effects, too, effects that could be added up in dollars and cents. The Women's Citizens Committee was making headway. Mrs. Griffith.
We definitely feel that some headway has been made. We know that in the relief money alone to dependent children, it's made a difference of $500,000 to the taxpayers. That means because those gambling places are closed, with them closed, the men can't go to those places, cash their checks on their way home, and reach home with nothing.
Remember when Gary was called the second crime center of the country? Well, the climate is different in Gary today. Syndicated crime is no more. All candidates for public office are pledged to good government and law enforcement. The women have destroyed the core of the criminal political alliance, destroyed it by exercising their rights as citizens. Prosecutor Stanton.
They destroyed the governmental setup which allowed the syndicates to operate in this county unmolested for all these years. They destroyed it by throwing out the key man. The professional politician who was hurt by the women's activities would naturally try to discount their force and power and ridicule, perhaps. But most of them who resorted to that are now in the discard.
Gary, Indiana, Steel Town. The power of the average citizen, the man and woman in the street. Do you go along with those who say citizens in a democracy cannot act in their own behalf? The women of Gary prove otherwise. But note well how the women have made their progress, who they are, what they are working for.
We are Protestant, Catholic, and Jew. We are Democrat and Republican. We are rich and poor. We are colored and white. We are young and old. But we have a supreme purpose that unites us all. Every ounce of energy we can muster will be used to make our city the kind of place we dream of for our children to grow up in. Not one of us alone, nor any group of us alone, could do this, could possibly do it. But together, united, with devotion to the cause, it can be accomplished.
You have just heard The People Act, narrated by Robert Trout, a new documentary series presented by the Television Radio Workshop and produced by the CBS Radio Network. These programs are under the sponsorship of the National Committee for the People Act. Here is the committee's director, Elmore McKee.
The people of Gary help to make the free world strong. If this story applies to a problem in your area, and you would like to do something about it, won't you write us at the People Act Center, State College, Pennsylvania? Dr. Milton S. Eisenhower and his associates there will try to put you in touch with someone who will help you. If you'd like a script or recording of today's program for use in your community, write us at the People Act Center, State College, Pennsylvania.
The People Act is written and produced by Irving Gitlin. Tonight's program was tape recorded in the field by Dave Moore. Original music by Norman Lockwood, conducted by Alfredo Antonini. Join us again next week when The People Act in Arlington, Virginia.